He spun on his heels, only to find the front half of the train car empty. Completely empty. It took him a moment to realize what was wrong with the picture. The bodies. They were gone. Not even a speck remained of the blood and gore, as if the two doctors had never existed. A chilling thought submerged his brain. Maybe it didn't leave the bodies. Maybe we interrupted it. Olivia, he began, turning towards her, but the words froze in his throat. Behind her, bubbling up from the floor like smoke, dark as if the lights reached suddenly ended, were many sightless eyes. Faces grew out of the shadows, 12, 2 dozen, oblong like mushroom heads embedded into a globule of pure dark. Myriad limbs kicking and pawing at the air. There was no time to warn her. Mitsue threw himself forward, knocking her to the ground just as the darkness fell on the spot where she'd been standing. Laughter filled the compartment, ringing off the metal, then crying and screaming. Voices, so many voices.
Please, God, help
sweet
me.
Blood. Mitsue gave Olivia no time to recover, but yanked her to her feet. Come on, he yelled, dragging her towards the door. The Noctura swiveled, its features squishing and reorienting. A second later it flowed after them, its sides squeezing up the walls, ebbing and flowing like a black tide. Reaching the door, Mitsue and Olivia exploded out into the night, the wind screaming in their ears. Mitsue slammed the door shut. You have to jump, he shouted into Olivia's inanimate face. She stared back as if she hadn't heard him. He shook her. Now! The violence seemed to jar her back to her senses. She climbed over the railing. With a push from behind, she leapt the gap, landing easily on the other side. Mitsue made to follow, throwing one leg over the railing, but then he stopped, held perfectly still. The voices seethed around the door, begging, pleading, arguing, screaming. Only now among them he heard one more, one that he recognized, one that had used to sing to him as the evening sank into the west, and now in the language of his childhood, it sang once more, saying, And when you've gone, like snow in the mountains, to rush through meadow and valley to the sea, still I'll wait, still I'll wait. He froze, unable to move, spellbound by the melody, by the voice he recognized as that of his mother. For a time he simply listened. He heard summer simmering beneath the words, the wind breezing in the boughs of the sakura in the garden, the shamisen plucking its staccato accompaniment. Mitsue, the voice called to him. Mitsue, come to me. He turned back, wanting nothing more than to run to that voice, to be forever locked in that embrace that smelled of plums. He stepped down from the railing, but as he did, there came another voice, calling to him. Mitsue, it shouted, and he recognized it as Olivia's. Mitsue, she yelled, jump! And though it lacked the lilt of that gentle melody, though it sounded coarse and unrefined after such sweetness, those sharp words cut through the enchantment. He returned to the present, to the shrieks of the Noctura, to the strain of the steel door as the dark mass pressed against it. Now once more in control of his body, he jumped. Air buffeted him as he fell through the darkness. The light wavered. Then he landed, and Olivia helped him over the railing. We need to disconnect the car, she said, taking the lighter from his hand. Will that work? It's the best I've got. She crawled to the edge of the platform. Hang on to me. He barely had time to grab hold of her ankles before she plunged over the side, down towards the train's coupling. A moment later, the door of the freight car burst off its hinges, the Noctura gushing out like a wave of oil. It coalesced, growing upwards, movement made corporeal, the shadowy substance of it boiling and writhing. Heads sloped down its back, then straightened, turning, scenting the air. 100 cavernous eyes looked upon him, sucking at his light. It's all happening again. Once more he saw the attic in Abbess Carmine's office, the liquid shadows rising through the trapdoor. We're going to die. Any moment the Noctura would push across to them, and they'd sink down into the black. He imagined it filling his mouth, flooding his nostrils, gagging, choking, coughing, the heavy feel of it in his lungs as everything went dark. He raised his left hand, still holding on to Olivia with his right. He needed to ignite. If he could ignite, it would all be over. Come on. He closed his eyes, reaching for the power, feeling in the dark corners of his mind. Come on. And then suddenly he felt it. Warmth. Light. He fell through it and into it. A chaos of emotions swallowed him and bore him down. And he was himself, and then he wasn't. He was Mitsue, and then he wasn't. He was human, and then he wasn't. A terrible shuddering heartbeat filled his ears, and it was his heartbeat, and yet not only his. The sound of it raked the inside of his brain, growing till it boiled his thoughts, and they poured out of his head, growing till the sound was all and everything, and in it, in the pulse, the agony and ecstasy of eternity. He opened his eyes, alive with it, the strings of his veins glowing, his heart pushing fire. Power. He had so much power, power enough to do anything. The light drizzled down through his arm, gathering in his palm, searing his muscles and his bones. But then he saw her in his memory. Rei. She reached towards him, her fingers extending, inches away from him. The growing light wiped away the imperfections of her skin, made her more beautiful than she'd ever been before. She looked afraid, and her fear was stunning and terrible. And then she was lifted up into the light, and she became the light. He clenched his teeth. Tears poured from his eyes and sizzled on his cheeks, and the steam fell away on the night air. His hands trembled. I can't. And with that thought, the power leaked out of him. The Noctura rose, preparing to come down on them. This is it, he thought distantly. He was almost glad. He shut his eyes and waited. Got it, Olivia shouted. With a sharp snap and hiss of air, the train car broke loose, its brakes automatically engaging as soon as it came untethered. It dropped into the distance behind them. For a moment the Noctura held perfectly still, its many unseeing eyes staring after them as the car slowed. And Mitsue thought they'd done it, thought they were safe. His heart soared, but then the dark mass of it slid down the side of the car and slopped onto the tracks. Its shape contorted, bulging forwards then retracting, picking up speed as it gushed towards them. Mitsue pulled Olivia up by the ankles. He saw his fear mirrored in her eyes. The Noctura was gaining on them. Arms grew out of its back, all different sizes and shapes and lengths, with too many fingers or not enough, with claws or eyes or mouths studding the oozing dark. And they reached forward, grabbed onto the edge of the train, and then slowly began to haul the massive bulk upwards. The dark, twisted body gushed over the railing. From the ink-black depths rose a face, a neck, shoulders. Mitsue recognized it. The voices of the Noctura squirmed like maggots, but high above them he heard his mother, as her form separated from the darkness. Mitsue, she said, breathlessly, offering her hand to him. Without meaning to, Mitsue reached towards her, but then the train door tore open behind them, and a storm of fire went roaring past, and the Noctura exploded into ropes of blood and coils of thick black smoke.